Last year, Britain's Labour government were forced, kicking and screaming, to jump aboard what Keir Starmer had previously dismissed as a bandwagon of the far right, and announced the state's statutory backing for 3 local grooming gang inquiries in just 3 locations of the up to 55 towns and cities that we know were targeted by the scandal. And former Home Secretary Yvette Cooper ran out the clock on appointing the chair and setting the terms of reference for the inquiries, and passed it along to Pakistani Muslim Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood instead, the woman who says that her Muslim faith guides everything she does in her life, including her calling to be a public servant. And Mahmood, in March, posted the grooming gang scandal as one of the darkest moments in our country's history. The Independent National Inquiry will now begin its crucial work to uncover how these crimes were allowed to happen and root out failure wherever it occurred. There will be no hiding place for the predatory monsters who committed these vile crimes. So a few problems with this. Firstly, it's still going on, so she's talking about it as if it's in the past tense. Secondly, we have plenty of reason to doubt whether or not the inquiry will actually fulfill its promises. And in this video, I'm going to go through a short history of everything we've known about the grooming gangs between the 70s and the 2010s, which is going to be omitted, plenty of it, by this inquiry, relying on lots of my own research as well as work done by the journalist Peter McLaughlin in his 2016 book, Easy Meat, to explain why we should be in doubt that this is anything but just another cover-up, another containment exercise, a kicking of the issue into the long grass until after the next general election to try to wash Labour's hands of their culpability in this, and the establishment more broadly, because we know, thanks to statements by former Conservative Chancellor George Osborne on his terrible podcast with Ed Balls, who was in the Children's Department under the Blair Labour government, which was meant to be dealing with this but didn't. Osborne said that the Conservatives knew this was going on, but couldn't make any political capital about it, and so didn't campaign on the issue. So multiple governments, civil servants, local officials, the police, politicians have been culpable in this scandal. They've covered it up either to smooth over community cohesion or stop what they were worried would be race riots resulting from the way that one community has violated and brutalized another, or they just didn't think that it was enough of a stick with which to beat their political opponents, and so they just didn't do anything about the worst child exploitation scandal in British history. So the terms of reference were set out in March, published by the Home Office. The purpose and objectives of the inquiry include, under sections 4.3 and 4.4, examining the factors that allowed or caused exploitation and abuse to happen, and go unaddressed at a local and national level, including the role of ethnicity, religion, and culture of perpetrators and victims. So they are supposed to look into the ethnic and religious disparity between the Pakistani Muslim perpetrators, largely Pakistani, and the predominantly white, working-class, English victims. Are they going to do that? Again, there's reason to doubt, because if you go to the scope section, the inquiry will examine issues arising between the 1st of January 1996 and the 31st of March 2029. But we know the scandal happened long before that, and this is going to have £65 million dedicated to it, per the statement delivered by Shabana Mahmood on the 13th of April 2026, and it is going to conclude in 2029, so after the next election. How convenient. This is the inquiry chair, Baroness Anne Longfield. She was appointed a Labour Baroness on the 31st of January 2025, so she is a beneficiary of the Labour Party's patronage network. She is joined by 2 co-panellists, that's Zoe Billingham, CBE, a former inspector, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, and the current chair of Norfolk and Suffolk NHS Foundation Trust, so someone who is deeply enmeshed in the systems that are trying to cover their own arse, but perhaps she will fulfill her duties, and Eleanor Kelly, CBE, the former Chief Executive of Southwark Council, so she has experience auditing councils. However, Longfield is to be regarded with suspicion because she was the Children's Commissioner between the 1st of March 2015 and the 1st of March 2021. during which time the original Alexis J. and Louise Casey inquiries into Rotherham, as well as the Telford inquiries, were conducted and published. So she has, in her capacity as Children's Commissioner, overseen previous inquiries and reports and news cycles about the grooming gangs, and did nothing. She also oversaw this, a scandal involving the Children's Commissioner's office. So this was former Deputy Children's Commissioner Sue Berelowitz, who was criticised for not actually doing anything about the grooming gangs on the lead-up to the 2012 Children's Commissioner report, which published data that found an overrepresentation of Asian, Pakistani Muslim, it's not the Japanese fault, perpetrators among those convicted for child exploitation, group-based child exploitation and grooming in particular. She took voluntary redundancy from her almost £100,000 a year paid position on the 30th of April 2015 and was given £134,000 in severance pay by the taxpayer and then rehired the next day on about £960. So she was rehired as a consultant the following day on a rate that apparently broke Whitehall rules and meant that she had to be stripped of her lucrative contract. However, Baroness Anne Longfield defended this in her capacity as Children's Commissioner, saying that Sue was doing vital work. Well, what was that vital work? Sue oversaw this interim report in November of 2012. I thought I was the only one in the world. This is the Office of Children's Commissioner's inquiry into child exploitation in gangs and groups. We have to censor some words because we're on YouTube. She was one of the authors of this, and on page 15, it summarises the perpetrators. The perpetrators say the substantial majority of perpetrators identified by the inquiry were men and boys. Of the total number of perpetrators identified in the call for evidence, 72% were male, 10% were female, and in 18% of cases, the gender was undisclosed. Only 0.01% of the perpetrators disclosed in the site visits were female and the rest were male. As with the victim data, individuals classed as white form the largest group of perpetrators in both gangs and groups. Black and minority ethnic individuals, particularly those loosely recorded or reported as Asian, are the second largest category of perpetrators, reported via the call for evidence. However, white British males were the only perpetrators identified in all site visits, and perpetrators from various ethnic groups, in addition to white, British and Asian, were found in both the site visits and call for evidence. So, the inquiry reported that white British males were the majority perpetrators of child abuse and grooming offences. However, as McLaughlin summarises in Easy Meat, the National Crime Agency report found that Asian men, Pakistanis, were 28% of perpetrators, while white men were 30% of the perpetrators. And the Children's Commissioner report in 2012, when you dig into the raw data, found that 21% of perpetrators were Asian, while white men were 27% of perpetrators. When it came to the victims of localised grooming, the CEOP report found Asian girls were 3% of victims, but white girls were 61% of victims, and the Children's Commissioner's report found that 4% of victims were Asian, while 50% of the victims were white. So in effect, the Children's Commissioner's 2012 report ended up reconfirming the findings of the National Crime Agency's CEOP report. So they found a vast per capita overrepresentation of Asian Pakistani offenders in child exploitation and grooming crimes, and they found that the victims were overwhelmingly the racial outgroup. They were white, they were British. So they found the disparity between Pakistani Muslim perpetrators and white British victims all the way back in 2012, and yet reported it as if it was white men that were the problem. Sue Berelowitz oversaw this cover-up, and Anne Longfield decided to defend her. On the 25th of May 2015, the Children's Commissioner put out a statement justifying the severance pay and the consultancy fee that Sue Berelowitz was paid, and then, just a couple of days later on the 29th, Anne Longfield herself made a statement under pressure from the press, saying, "I've been advised by the Department for Education that they now judge our contract with Sue Berelowitz to lead the inquiry into child abuse within the family context to fall outside government rules, and have therefore cancelled it. We are considering how the inquiry will continue with its important work, which we are all firmly committed to." So she only cancelled the contract because the press raised the fact that the fee was egregious, and then the Department of Education admitted that it broke Whitehall rules. But otherwise, Anne Longfield wanted Sue Berelowitz, the woman who said, despite a disproportionate per capita overrepresentation of Pakistani offenders against white children, that white men were to blame, she wanted Berelowitz to carry out another child exploitation inquiry on behalf of the Children's Commissioner's Office. And this is the woman now overseeing Labour's local grooming gang inquiries, after the scandal was reignited in 2015 by their attempt to cover it up in Oldham. Speaking of Oldham, remember, the cancellation of a local grooming gang inquiry in the town was the reason why this scandal was reignited in early 2025. The conversation began on X, thanks to Elon Musk. His attention was brought to the scandal because Sam Bidwell and Fraser Nelson were arguing about immigration and integration. Bidwell used the grooming gangs as an example of why immigration has been appalling, and then people contributed, like Sam Ashworth-Hayes, Charlie Peters, Stephen Edgington, myself, and Max Tempers. And then discourse spilled over into real life because Charlie Peters released the story, originally on GB News, but it was reported by other outlets, including this one here, ITV, that Jess Phillips, as the Home Office Safeguarding Minister for Women and Girls, had rejected a request by Oldham Council to have the government supervise and handle their grooming gang inquiry because they believed that Oldham Council, historically controlled by Labour but now controlled by both Reform and Muslim independents, would mishandle it because they were too complicit in the cover-up to actually admit that there was grooming going on in the town by the Pakistani community against the English community. And after months of delay, Jess Phillips wrote back flippantly, saying, "I believe it is for Oldham Council alone to decide to commission an inquiry into child exploitation locally, rather than for the government to intervene." So she attempted to delay and defer and deny, which is why recently a Home Affairs Select Committee meeting, Bradford MP Robbie Moore highlighted that it's just Oldham that's been selected so far, the other two towns haven't been announced. And also, are the Home Office credible to carry out this inquiry under Mahmood, under Phillips, under the various civil servants that got the previous inquiries wrong and have denied that this phenomena even exists as recently as 2024? Shouldn't the Cabinet Office oversee it instead? And the problem you have there is now Antonio Romeo is the most senior civil servant in the Cabinet Office, that alongside Baroness Ruth Anderson, formerly Smeeth, who is a patron of Hope Not Hate, and so it will just get covered up no matter who's in charge as long as this government is doing it. We have an update on Oldham because Keir Starmer has appointed Harriet Harman as his advisor on women and girls. Bear in mind she can't define what a woman is because she thinks trans women are women. Nonetheless, Nick Timothy MP has raised an issue here that Harriet Harman has since deleted a tweet that says, in response to Shah Arouge, "Hi, hope all is good with you for our next Lords list," implying that she wants to make Shah Arouge a member of the House of Lords, a Labour peer. Who is Shah Arouge? She's the leader of Oldham Council, who sought to block the grooming gang inquiry at a local level. She's also childhood friends of a man with the nickname Irish Immy, who apparently murdered 2 policemen with handguns and grenades. Oh, and as I pointed out in this seismic ratio beneath Keir Starmer's post announcing Harman's position, Harman herself worked for Liberty, previously named the National Council for Civil Liberties, which was at the time affiliated with the Paedophile Information Exchange. And when this was brought to her attention, she thought she had nothing to apologise for and still doesn't. So he is appointing a Labour Member of Parliament who has previous links to the Paedophile Information Exchange to supervise a strategy for the safety of women and girls, who thinks that the leader of Oldham Council who tried to block the grooming gang inquiry, which led to the scandal that then has now launched these national grooming gang inquiries, which is also targeting Oldham, she, Harriet Harman, thinks that the woman that blocked it should be in the House of Lords, and that's who Keir Starmer has appointed. Do we think that the Labour government are capable of overseeing this with any level of transparency and fulfilling their promises to examine the role of ethnicity, religion, and race in the disparity between perpetrators and victims? Because I certainly don't. And the problems just keep compounding. This was the parliamentary research briefing that was published alongside the announcement of the terms of reference and the chair in March of 2026. And if you scroll down to the introductory summary, it says, why have there been calls for an inquiry? And it says, by the early 2010s, multiple child abuse scandals had prompted public concern about the state response to organised and systematic child abuse. And it lists Rolf Harris, Jimmy Savile, and then Rotherham, Oldham, and Rochdale. But if you notice, it starts in the 2010s. So it omits not just the Blair and Brown years, which oversaw, knew about this, covered it up because they realised that their councils and their client voting bloc, Pakistanis and Muslims, were culpable in not just the perpetration of the scandal and the crimes, but the cover-up, but it also omits the decades of abuse preceding the Blair and Brown governments, which we know happened, and we know that the police weren't just complicit in covering up, but actually participated in the abuse. We have grooming gang victims and survivors who say, my abusers were policemen. So the inquiry itself is going to omit, just by its terms of reference, starting from 1996, but also the Parliamentary research briefing, decades of complicity, of cover-up, and crimes. So how long have the state known about this? Well, I documented many of these instances in a X thread, and also in a lengthy Substack piece that everyone can read. All of the sources are hyperlinked in the Substack piece. I will link it at the top of the description. But the first glaring omission I wanted to point out was that we've known that there have been 50 towns and cities affected by this for a very long time. New locations were uncovered during Rupert Lowe's private grooming gang inquiry, but Charlie Peters and Adam Wren and other people involved have created an interactive map and a timeline with the various cases that have happened across the country, including in Newcastle, Carlisle, Barrow-in-Furness, Bradford, Kirklees, Doncaster, Buckinghamshire, Canterbury, Chelmsford, Tower Hamlets, Barking and Dagenham, South Somerset, Plymouth. So it's all over the country. And so far, we only have one location announced as the target of the inquiry out of 3, and that location has had to be pulled like a tooth. Meanwhile, senior figures in government want to reward the people who tried to block the initial inquiry with a peerage in the House of Lords. But we also know this has been happening across the country for over a decade, because in May of 2013, the Daily Mirror reported that Thames Valley Police Chief Constable Sarah Thornton said officers had identified networks of perverts and child abusers operating between different cities and towns as part of Operation Bullfinch, and she expected that every city in Britain had one of these networks operating in them, including London. Now, bar Newham and Tower Hamlets on that interactive map, we don't have vast quantities of grooming gangs convicted for operating in London. But if they're operating in Oxford, in Bradford, in Leicester, in all other towns that have been enriched by diversity, including in white majority towns like Rotherham and Rochdale that just have pockets of Pakistani enclaves, but nevertheless, it's like 1 in 30 Pakistani men in Telford were perpetrators. It's that ubiquitous, even though the population's very small. We expect it would be happening across London. And even though Sadiq Khan keeps playing dumb when questioned by Susan Hall as to what the definition of a grooming gang even is, back in 2014, Scotland Yard detectives of the Met Police were investigating 50 very serious child grooming cases in London. So, again, 12 years ago, we knew that this was happening across London, but for some reason, London is not being examined as part of a national or even a statutory-backed local inquiry. Sadiq Khan continues to deny this and obviously run cover for his religion and his co-ethnics, and nothing gets done by the government because Keir Starmer made a promise to Sadiq Khan to root out Islamophobia, and they've been long-standing friends and allies and members of the Fabian Society, so they're not going to turn in each other. So the government is unwilling and incapable of examining the locations where we know these crimes have gone on for decades, and yet they've been covered up and nothing has been done. We know the Labour government, and Parliament more broadly, have known about this scandal since 2013, at the very least, because this is the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee Child Exploitation and Response to Localised Grooming report from 2013 to 2014. And members of the Home Affairs Committee include Labour MP Keith Vaz and the current Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. She voted against the grooming gang inquiry when the Conservatives attempted to make an amendment to her schools bill last year to force a national inquiry. And she also has stood by in Cabinet as her colleague, Lucy Powell, dismissed the grooming gangs as a little trumpet and a far-right dog whistle. So, Bridget Phillipson has no excuse. She was on the committee that compiled this report over a decade ago, and now pretends like this isn't a problem that requires her government address it. But this report was honest about the disparity in ethnicity and religion between the victims and the perpetrators. On page 19, regarding Rochdale and Rotherham, they said, "During the inquiry, we have taken evidence on the response of local authorities to child exploitation with a focus on children's social care in Rochdale and Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Councils. There have been high-profile trials in both areas, Operation Central in Rotherham, in which 5 men were convicted of offences relating to localised grooming and child exploitation offences in 2010, and Operation Span in Rochdale, in which 9 men were convicted of offences relating to localised grooming and child exploitation in 2012. So they were admitting that there were large public trials about the problem in Rotherham and Rochdale, spanning between 2010 and 2012. On page 57, the ethnic breakdown was admitted. They say, "There is no simple link between race and child exploitation. It is a vile crime which is perpetrated by a small number of individuals and abhorred by the vast majority from every ethnic group. However, evidence presented to us suggests that there is a model of localized grooming of Pakistani heritage men targeting young white girls. This must be acknowledged by official agencies, who we were concerned to hear in some areas of particular community tension have reportedly been slow to draw attention to the issue for fear of affecting community cohesion. The condemnation from those communities of this vile crime should demonstrate that there is no excuse for tiptoeing around the issue. It is important that police, social workers, and others be able to raise their concerns freely without fear of being labelled racist." So they knew all the way back in 2013 that state officials, the police, local councillors, social workers working in children's homes didn't raise concerns because they were afraid of upsetting community cohesion or being called racist. And yet, they acknowledged that it was Pakistani men perpetrating these crimes against white English girls. They even capitalized the W in white. You cannot make a mistake about the ethnic compositions of the victims and perpetrators. This has been known for over a decade, and yet, Labour politicians still sitting in government, despite overseeing the actual report I'm reading from here, still call the scandal racist. They dismiss, they downplay, they deny, they defer, and they have kicked this inquiry into the long grass and appointed people who do not want to examine the disparity between victims and perpetrators, and so probably won't deliver justice. This was clear as daylight back in 2013 because copious amounts of evidence had been gathered by journalists like Andrew Norfolk and Julie Bindel. They say on page 52 that the vast majority of convicted child abuse offenders in the UK are single white men. However, with this specific model of offending, there is a widespread perception that the majority of perpetrators are of Asian, British Asian, or Muslim origin. This would certainly seem to be the case from the major grooming prosecutions which have gone to court so far, but in fact, both the CEOP and the Office of the Children's Commissioner have found serious inconsistencies with recording of ethnicities and gender of both victims and perpetrators across UK forces. So they referenced the CEOP and 2012 Children's Commissioner report in here to say, well, the picture isn't quite as clear about whether or not Asian offenders, Pakistanis, make up the majority of the perpetrators of crimes against white English girls. Instead, they say, no, white people still make up the majority, but they don't dig into the per capita, and they can get away with not doing that, even though they admit later in this paper that there is a pattern of Pakistani predators targeting white children. They can get away with ignoring per capita because of the editorializing by the 2012 Children's Commissioner report conducted by Sue Berelowitz, which was then excused and then attempted to be recycled by Anne Longfield, who is now overseeing the current grooming gang inquiries launched by this Labour government. Nevertheless, they continue that given the number of child exploitation cases which have so far failed to make it to court for the reasons discussed, this highly unsatisfactory situation means that it's extremely difficult to form an evidence-based opinion on the true nature of what is still a largely hidden crime. This problem persists, by the way, because Baroness Louise Casey's 2025 audit said that there is insufficient data gathered on the ethnicity of the perpetrators, even when there is ethnicity data gathered on the victims. But in the cases where she has got ethnicity data, in Manchester, in Rotherham, over 60% of the perpetrators are Pakistani. So we know that this is a disproportionate problem. And again, the pattern keeps cropping up in the Quilliam report, in this report, in previous reports that the Home Office didn't even publish, which we'll get to in a moment. Yet the government that is overseeing this inquiry keeps denying it, despite promising to examine the disparity. Nevertheless, the perception that grooming perpetrators are largely of Asian, British Asian, or Muslim origin colours the attitudes of those working in the field, as well as the media and the wider public. Anne Cryer, the former Labour MP for Keighley, who raised concerns about localised grooming in her constituency as long ago as 2003, faced a backlash when she described the offenders as Asian and pointed to the fact that most of them come from the Mirpur district of Kashmir, a description which she still stands by. She suggested that underlying cultural attitudes might be a factor in the offending, as Andrew Norfolk, of The Times, told the Home Affairs Select Committee, quote, "The far right leapt on the story predictably, and Anne Cryer was accused of demonising all Muslims. I think that it almost acted as a brake for several years on anybody seriously looking at whether there was any truth in what she was saying, but as the years passed, I noticed cases cropping up from time to time across Yorkshire and Lancashire with a very similar pattern." So, even the brave vanguard whistleblowers Anne Cryer and Andrew Norfolk refrained from reporting on the story because they were afraid of the far right. The far right, at the time they were talking about the British National Party, wouldn't have existed if this scandal hadn't gone on, if these men weren't here, if the authorities hadn't covered it up, if the taboo of racism was not so powerful that children were sacrificed to preserve it. And again, this was known over 10 years ago, so why are we still having this conversation? It's because the government engages in limited hangouts. It lets slip a little bit of the narrative. It allows a little bit of the truth to permeate in the public conversation, just so you feel that you've been heard, that there is a pressure release valve, there is a catharsis, and then they promise an inquiry, and they delay and defer, and drag out the issue beyond the news cycle, because I guarantee lots of you have forgotten about this. I'm only reporting on it to make sure it doesn't fall out of the headlines. And they appoint, intentionally, people who are unwilling to examine the issue properly or are too incompetent. They allow the inquiry to limit its terms of reference so that fewer people get implicated, nobody gets investigated, nobody gets prosecuted, nobody goes to prison, nobody gets stripped of their pensions or loses their job. Nobody's even been deported over this. So this entire exercise is just another, as we've seen over the last few decades, of obfuscation, of washing their hands of any culpability and making sure that nobody is actually held to account. As the report notes on Norfolk's reporting, there was little media coverage of the issue in the intervening years, but in 2010 there were 2 trials which saw groups of Asian men convicted for offences against white British girls. In November 2010, 5 men from Rotherham were jailed after being found guilty of grooming teenage girls, and less than 2 weeks later, 9 men from Derby were convicted of offences having been found to have been systematically grooming and abusing teenage girls. The first of the series of Andrew Norfolk's Times articles on the subject was published several days before the ringleaders in the Derby case were sentenced, and listed 17 trials that had been identified as prosecutions related to localised grooming. In all but one of the trials, the offenders were identified as being Asian, mostly British Pakistani, and the victims were predominantly white. And when Ella Cockbain, the Guardian's favourite academic who denies and downplays the role of race, ethnicity and religion in the abuse, and again, after the 2020 Home Office report was published, she ran with the line that white men were mostly responsible, a claim that Baroness Louise Casey has since refuted as based on no evidence. Ella Cockbain's original studies, for which there are Guardian articles that have since been deleted but archived, found that about 80% of the sample of the perpetrators from the trials that she looked into were Pakistani. And she said, this finding is alarming, but I don't want to draw any conclusions from this. So even the academics that intend to deny the scandal as a racist fantasy of the far right, they're looking into these historic cases and finding the same pattern as Andrew Norfolk. The problem with this report, though, is the cases cited are cover-ups, because on page 55, they say, there is a concern that statutory agencies are now looking only for a model as presented in the high-profile localised grooming cases, where the aspect of race is emphasised rather than looking for incidents of child exploitation as a whole. So they try to broaden out the issue in order to deflect blame away from one community perpetrating a specific kind of abuse on the other, because the perpetrator community, it's a Labour client block, and it also does unrecoverable damage to the narrative of colourblind, liberal multiculturalism. They cite, for example, that 5 white British men from Derby were sentenced for offences relating to child exploitation in September 2012, so it's obvious that such crimes are perpetrated by offenders of all races. The problem that they have is this is the case, as reported by The Guardian, so I can't even be accused of using a biased far-right source here. And they say 5 men who have preyed on vulnerable teenage girls have been found guilty of paying for the adult services of a child. And these are the names. A jury at Derby Crown Court heard how Anthony Lambert, 51, Stephen Godfrey, 44, John Shaw, 54, Ijaz Ahmed, 35, and Mark Adouai, 40, picked up the girls from care homes and streets in Derby and paid them up to £30 to perform adult acts. Do all 5 of those men sound white British to you? No. Is Ijaz Ahmed white? No. So there is misreporting of these cases in the 2013 inquiry that said, well, white people commit these crimes too, so it's not just a Pakistani issue. I mean, it sounds like there was a Pakistani perpetrator, even in this gang, and was he the ringleader? Was he the coordinator? Did he procure the girls via an extended trafficking network and then sell them to white paedophiles who also deserve the death penalty? We don't know. And I tell you who certainly doesn't know, this parliamentary report. So even in the chronicling of these problems that allows a little bit of truth to seep through, even in previous inquiries overseen by, this was meant to be the Conservative government, even then, they editorialise the historic cases and say that this was 5 white British men from Derby, and include in those 5 white British men Ijaz Ahmed and Mark Adouai. As for the other gang mentioned from Derby in 2010, this is much more a typical example of the grooming gangs. This is Likat and Sadiq. These were the 2 brothers that were running the gang. Many of the victims were given alcohol or drugs before being forced to be prostituted in cars, rented houses, or hotels across the Midlands. So they were also trafficked. And one girl described being assaulted by at least 8 men at once. 27 girls came forward to say they were victims, the youngest of whom was 12, and the oldest was 18. The ringleaders were Abid Mohammed Sadiq, 27, and Mohammed Roman Likat, 28. Sadiq was convicted of 4 counts of rape, 2 counts of false imprisonment, 2 of assault, 3 charges of activity with a child, perverting the course of justice, and aiding and abetting rape. Likat was found guilty of 1 count of rape, 2 of assault, aiding and abetting, affray, and 4 counts of activity with a child. Both pleaded guilty to causing a person under the age of 18 to be involved with pornography. So they ritualistically tortured these girls, and then they recorded it and distributed it. 13 men were arrested in relation to Operation Retriever. 11 stood trial for a string of charges. Of the original 13, 9 were convicted of offences against vulnerable girls ranging from rape to false imprisonment. Other defendants already convicted were Akshay Kumar, Faisal Mehmood, Mohammed Imran Rehman, and Graham Blackman. Oh, and Likat's brother, Naweed Likat and Farouk Ahmed, pled guilty to perverting the course of justice and were both jailed for 18 months, and Ziafat Yazin was cleared of charges relating to child abuse, but then pled guilty to being concerned in the supply of cocaine, so he was involved in the drug trafficking trade that then led the girls to be sedated and abused. So there was one English guy, Graham Blackham, traitor, who was involved in this network, but the rest were fraternal, blood-related Pakistanis. Telegraph reporting at the time has more details on this case, which, again, the parliamentary report decided not to include. The brothers, of course, involved in the drug trade and the trafficking trade, were driving their flash new BMWs around. That's what they would use to pick up the girls from care homes. They would pick their victims up day and night from anywhere, at train stations, on estates, in the city centre, walking home from school. They would be charmed, given drink and drugs, and after their mobile numbers were exchanged, they would be contacted to meet up, go to a party, or for a drive where the abuse took place. In one incident, Sadiq, who was convicted of 14 of the 29 charges he faced, was accused of engaging in activity with a 12-year-old in Derby's picturesque Darley Park, while his accomplice Likat, who was convicted of 10 crimes, had intercourse with a 14-year-old in the BMW. Another time, a 14-year-old girl was filmed being abused by 3 of the gang in a hotel room as they were cheering. And it was this horrific case that led former Home Secretary Jack Straw to make the easy meat remark live on BBC Newsnight. So again, we've known about these scandals, the horrific extent of the abuse, the ethnicity and religion and motives of the perpetrators versus the victims for decades. Successive governments have known about it and done nothing. And now we expect the Labour government currently in power, who have appointed the same people responsible for excusing and perpetuating previous cover-ups to do anything about it, while it's all supervised by a Pakistani Muslim Home Secretary, who's really concerned about people who don't accept her as English. Sorry, I just don't buy this for a minute. Straw said there is a specific problem which involves Pakistani heritage men who target vulnerable young white girls. Pakistanis, let's be clear, are not the only people who commit these offences, and overwhelmingly the offenders' wings of prisons are full of white offenders. But we need to get the Pakistani community to think much more clearly about why this is going on, and to be more open about the problems that are leading to a number of Pakistani heritage men thinking it is okay to target white girls in this way. He called on the Pakistani community to be more open about the issue. They're not going to be, and added, these young men are in a Western society. In any event, they act like any other young men. They're fizzing and popping with testosterone. They want some outlet for that, but Pakistani heritage girls are off limits, and they're expected to marry a Pakistani girl from Pakistan, typically. So, they then seek out other avenues, and they see these young women, white girls who are vulnerable, some of them in care, who they think are easy meat. And because they're vulnerable, they ply them with gifts, they give them drugs, and then, of course, they're trapped. Labour MPs were predictably outraged. Khalid Mahmood, the Labour MP for Birmingham Perry Barr, said Straw was wrong to accuse British Pakistani men of targeting white girls. Quote, to generalise in this stereotypical manner and castigate a whole community is not becoming of him. There are Asian men who will do the same thing to Muslim and Pakistani girls. They are indiscriminate and will take the chance wherever they can. Rather than just whinging about it, he should have sorted it out by educating his community over the last 30 years while he's been an MP. Mahmood's criticism was echoed by Keith Vaz, chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who, produced this report. Vaz said, I don't think this is a cultural problem. I don't think you can stereotype an entire community. Why didn't Jack Straw say something about this? He's represented Blackburn for 31 years. He's been the Home Secretary. Which is curious, because Mahmood, last year, came out and backed Charlie Peters' call for a national inquiry. He said, we need to address the issues for the victims. The ICSA inquiry did find some issues, but what we really need to do is account for the feelings of these victims who have been absolutely annihilated in the process. They've had no respect or dignity given to them. We need to start a process by quickly setting up terms of reference to look into the historic areas, but also go after the criminals and the police and the local authorities who've been involved in this. They all need to be held to account for this. The victims have been abused for all their lives, and they need some closure on this. I agree, Khalid Mahmood. Why did you not do that 10 years ago? At the time, as well, the trials that were being referenced when Khalid Mahmood was saying, this is unfair racial stereotyping. Well, the judges in the trials were saying the crimes were racially motivated. As the report notes, in May 2012, while sentencing those convicted of similar offences in Rochdale, the judge noted the offenders had claimed the investigation was racially motivated. Quote, some of you, when arrested, said the prosecution was triggered by race. That is nonsense. What triggered this prosecution was your lust and your greed. He noted the victims in the case had been treated as though they were worthless, like easy meat, and beyond respect. He suggested, quote, one of the factors leading to that was the fact that they were not part of the defendant's community or religion. This was in-group on out-group violence, based on race, ethnicity, and religion, as admitted all the way back by the judge in a case in 2012. And yet, Khalid Mahmood at the time was saying that Jack Straw was wrong to say these men were treating these girls like easy meat, but now has decided, once he's been voted out, to say, oh, we absolutely need a national inquiry to bring closure on this. Okay, well, why were you and your colleagues, like Keith Vaz, who oversaw this report and the glaring omissions and outright falsehoods contained therein, blocking it at every stage while you were in Parliament? There's no excuse for their ignorance or outright lies here, because this report is again replete with statements made by Anne Cryer and Andrew Norfolk, and data from the trials that shows the ethnic disparity. This is a statement from Andrew Norfolk. He suggested that issues around the age of consent may play a role, pointing out that, quote, if you come from a rural village in Mirpur, the Kashmiri community, where whatever state law says, village tradition and Sharia says puberty is the green light for marriage, as it does, and if you recognise that most girls in this country are hitting puberty at 11 or 12, perhaps one begins to understand why it is not just lone offenders. There has to be something, given that so often this is a normalised group activity, not among a major criminal gang, but among friends, work colleagues and relatives, that does not have the same sense of shame attached to it as it would be the case for your typical white offender who works alone because if he told too many people, someone would report him. We are not the same. We do not think the same. We do not act the same. If I found out that someone I knew was a child predator, well, they'd be lucky if they lived to see a police report. But in the Pakistani community, as the 2013 Muslims Women Network lays out, just group-based exploitation is normal. If a Pakistani man calls up his friends, his cousins, and says, "I've got a girl drugged out of her mind in my bedroom, would you like to have a go?" there is a steady procession of men from the local Pakistani community, including, in the example they gave in that 2013 report, a man who showed up with his son, who is still in school uniform, who all go into the room and abuse the woman together. You don't understand these people. I don't want them here. They shouldn't be doing this. And we've known this is the case, again, for decades. And the government have done nothing, and you expect them to do something this time with the same people that did nothing before and tried to keep covering it up? I certainly don't. Both Anne Cryer and Andrew Norfolk suggested that a desire to protect the community from criticism might sometimes override the duty to address the criminal behaviour of these men. I have spoken to young men in some of the towns where this has been going on. Universally, they decry what happens. They say they're disgusted with the men who have been doing this, but equally, that they would never have dreamt of going to the police about it because you do not turn on your own community. There is also the line of reasoning offered by some witnesses, that these are socially conservative communities where such behaviour is not openly discussed, and so members of the community are not always aware that it is taking place. This is ISAT, this is face-saving, this is the shame culture, this is covering up the crimes in your midst to make sure that your family do not suffer the negative repercussions of the loss of reputation of one member contaminating their standing in the broader community. However, Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra acknowledged that, quote, "The fact that the cases have come to light that have been in court and the sentencing that we have so far witnessed includes a disproportionately larger number of Muslims and Asians, and that is very worrying." So even Muslims, like Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra or Dr. Taj Hargey, or the head of the Ramadan Foundation, Mohammed Shafiq, were admitting that this was a problem, and that Pakistanis didn't want to do anything about it. This is Shafiq's infamous 2016 article. Credit to Shafiq, he's been calling this out for decades now, and has been denounced by every other Muslim in the country because of it. Shafiq's cousins were actually part of the gangs, and he admitted that there are a number of Muslims, Pakistanis in Britain, who know this is going on, but want to cover it up. As he wrote here, the root cause lies in the British Pakistani community itself. The sad truth is that for years, some British Pakistanis have deliberately buried their heads in the sand about these predatory grooming gangs. More than this, they see any of us who try to tackle the problem as siding with the white enemy. They see us as their ethnic enemies. They see us as immodest, immoral, kafirs, unbelievers, who deserve to be punished. So why would they tell on their friends and family members, the men that line the pockets of the women and children of the community with the drug trade and trafficking and the illicit businesses that the women were abused in? Why would they snitch to the authorities that they don't see as part of their community, that they see as hostile? They wouldn't. And so, as long as you have these Pakistani colonies in your country, these crimes will always be perpetrated, and they will always be covered up by the friends and the family members and those who stand to lose financially or through reputation if they're honest about the crimes. As the report found in 2014, a factor that may reinforce the perception of localized grooming being carried out by Asian men against white girls could be the underreporting of offences against children from ethnic minorities, because witnesses told us there were groups of Asian men grooming Asian girls, but these do not come to light because victims are often alienated and ostracized by their own families and by the whole community if they go public with allegations of abuse. So yeah, absolutely, the women and girls in these communities are the targets of abuse, but they're the targets of abuse for different reasons. They're not denigrated, subjected to forced Quran readings, called white pejoratives and other swear words. They're not called Gora, which is a Pakistani slur for white people. They're not ritualistically tortured in the same way that English children are. And, unfortunately, the women and girls that have been abused by their husbands and brothers and cousins who are part of the grooming gangs have no sympathy for the white victims. As the Indian Muslim journalist Yasmin Alibhai Brown, who is a leftist, so she doesn't agree with me on anything, wrote back in 2017 after interviewing the wives, daughters, and family members who had been abused by convicted grooming gang members, found, when she asked, "Do you have sympathy for the girls that have been abused by your husbands and your brothers?" they said, White girls are, quote, filthy, how they dress, they have no shame, no fear of Allah. And Yasmin says, was it okay to hurt them the way that the men did? And she said, no, you can't hurt people, Allah does not want that. But it is the girls who should be careful, they did something to him, maybe bad magic. I am now alone, no money, no life. So they blame English children for being some sort of perennial temptress, bewitching these men, possessing them with a jinn, overriding their good Muslim nature and causing them to be child predators as part of organised prostituting, drug and trafficking gangs. Like, the women don't blame any of the men, and that's why they return after their criminally short prison sentences and reincorporate themselves seamlessly into the community. This is why survivors have had their perpetrators accidentally deliver food to their door, or they've spotted them in nightclubs or in supermarkets, because these men are not ostracized by their own community. Whereas, I mean, just look at the Jamie Bolger case. The perpetrators of that have had to be given new identities by the state, and every time it gets revealed, they get relocated under witness protection, because they know that even decades on, your average Englishman, if they find out that the person they're speaking to was actually the perpetrator of Jamie Bolger's torture and murder, then they would not be able to keep a job, they wouldn't have any friends, and they would probably be subjected to some retributive violence. Not the same among Pakistanis living in our country. The point is, the Parliamentary Labour Party, the government, the state, the civil service, the police, social workers, local councils, the media have known about this for at least a decade. But we know it's much longer. What have they done in that time? Remember, the entire psychodrama around just the Oldham local inquiry last year, to force for a national inquiry, involved Keir Starmer calling it a far-right bandwagon, Lucy Powell saying it was a racist dog whistle, Jess Phillips saying she was the real victim of harassment by Elon Musk. All of this was a massive media circus of calling everyone talking about the scandal racist, despite the disparity being admitted decades ago. It's the same conversation over and over again, because they just hope that you forget. They just hope that they can ignore the abuse being perpetrated by these communities that they've brought here, that they've farmed for votes, and that they extol as the diversity that is our country's sole strength. It's sick. And it's been going on for even longer than that. There have been cases of Pakistanis grooming young women in local newspapers dating back to the 50s, as soon as the migratory wave from Mirpur, caused by a dam breaking and the area being flooded, brought a few thousand Pakistanis into Britain. 1955, there was a Bradford grooming gang. In 1957, an instance of abuse by Pakistanis in Kent, in Keighley in West Yorkshire, near Bradford, in Halifax in Yorkshire in 1959. In 1960, there's one in Lancashire. In 1962, there was one in Hartlepool. In 1962, again, Faversham. In 1963, in Nelson. And in 64, again. In 1966, again in Yorkshire. In 1966, this is where the first case happens in Oldham. And then throughout the 60s and 70s, there are just instances of Pakistani perpetrators of murder and assault and child abuse, including in London, so Sadiq Khan shouldn't be able to play dumb. And then in 1979, we have an article from the Rotherham Advertiser that says, Girl 15 very well used. This dates just a couple of decades after the importation of thousands of Pakistanis into the area, and so it seems like the group-based exploitation has been going on for a very long time. There were these individual instances of Pakistani perpetrators abusing individual girls, but the organised nature of the grooming gangs in Rotherham dates back to the mid to late 70s. In Blackburn, it dates back to at least 1979, when retired Detective Superintendent Mick Gradwell was patrolling outside nightclubs where he saw Pakistani perpetrators driving around in BMWs and Mercedes, probably procured via their involvement in the drug trade, trying to pick up drunken girls. A pattern we see now because of the advent of camera phones, of just random Indians and Pakistanis and other Middle Eastern men lurking around outside nightclubs to try and lead drunk women away from their friends so they can assault them in packs. In 1996, one Rotherham Social Services investigation found 70 girls in residential care homes were being coerced into what they called child prostitution. Of course, there's no such thing. Which was then prompting a Home Office-funded research project in 1998, which concluded in 2001, and it was never published, but it found that Pakistani taxi firms and takeaway food shops were used to traffic girls procured outside schools, bus and train stations, residential care homes, and homeless projects. So again, this was known about all the way back into the 90s. That same year, in 2001, then Labour Home Secretary David Blunkett made his first attempt to try to criminalise criticism of Islam as incitement to religious hatred. That was scuppered by 9/11. He revised the defeated bill in 2006, while the Home Office was again investigating child exploitation in his constituency in Sheffield. In 2001, another Rotherham key players meeting concluded with risky businesses Adel Via intending to draft a letter to Blunkett. We don't know whether Blunkett ever received or even read that letter. This was all released recently by Sammy Woodhouse, a survivor from Rotherham, who's been working on Rupert Lowe's privately funded inquiry, who does excellent work, by the way. She also notes the minutes of a meeting from 2002 of key players in Rotherham, which show social services knew the names of the perpetrators who were later jailed. They named the children's homes and schools that those perpetrators picked girls up from, and the takeaways and the taxi firms and the hotels used to facilitate the abuse. Again, no preventative action was taken, but don't worry, an anti-racism coordinator was present to ensure that the narrative stayed within the acceptable parameters of state multiculturalism at all times. Instead, as well, in 2010, a Rotherham Safeguarding Children report stressed that local officials would ensure great care would be taken in drafting a report to ensure that its findings embrace Rotherham's qualities of diversity. It is imperative that suggestions of a wider cultural phenomenon are avoided. They have always denied it, dismissed it, and downplayed it. They've always sought to appease community cohesion and ensure the well-being of the Pakistani heritage community, according to the Casey and Jay report findings. The problem was only ever acknowledged as something that has to be covered up. And this was Rotherham MP Dennis McShane, and he admitted in a BBC radio interview that as a Guardian-reading liberal lefty, he was afraid to rock the multicultural community boat, if you could put it like that. Dennis McShane was then succeeded by Simon Danchuk, who in 2017 called the police on Katie Hopkins, because Katie Hopkins said, "How could you possibly pose the Pakistani flag when girls are being abused by Pakistani men in your own constituency?" Simon Danchuk tried to get her thrown in prison for that, and then has since, again, been doing the rounds saying, "Well, when I was in Labour, I always knew this was going on, and I tried to blow the whistle, but I was silenced." Sorry, you tried to get a woman who was telling the truth in the Sun thrown in prison for implicating the fact that you were doing nothing, and then years later you go, "Well, yeah, I did do nothing, but I intended to do something." Absolutely inexcusable. And then in McLaughlin's book, Easy Me, he actually accuses the Rotherham inquiries of being a designated scapegoat, because it only focuses on one town, it focuses on the inaction by the local council, but it doesn't look at the broader systemic issues of migration, of the Home Office knowing about the pattern, funding various charities that are ostensibly designed to combat the problem, but then never publishing their findings, never actually pushing forward policy that would stop the problem and send the perpetrators home. And it also doesn't examine the 50 other places in the country where this has happened. In 1988, gang violence broke out between Sikhs and Muslims because Muslims were grooming, drugging, and getting Sikh girls intoxicated, abusing them and forcing them to convert to Islam. There have been instances where Sikh girls thought they were abused by Sikh men, but then had to be told, no, your perpetrator wasn't wearing a turban, they were just your same ethnic group, they were actually Muslims. And McLaughlin lists a series of instances where Sikhs and Muslims escalated these tensions to violence, and the Sikhs were prosecuted, but as The Independent reported at the time, the backdrop to the gang violence was that the Muslims started it because they were abducting and abusing Sikh girls. In 2001, a group called Real Caliphate distributed a letter to Muslim youths that were encouraging them to intoxicate Sikh girls, abuse them, and convert them to Islam. And this prompted, this entire climate prompted the Sikh Awareness Society to establish themselves in 1998 to protect Sikh girls, which is why they haven't been the target since. But that same level of in-group solidarity, that same ability to act as essentially vigilantes, to police your own communities, has not been afforded to the white working class, who, when they went to the police with knowledge that their daughters had been abducted and were being housed in kebab shops, being abused, either the fathers were arrested or the daughters were arrested for being drunken, disorderly, and treated like prostitutes, rather than the perpetrators, because often the police were in leagues with them. They were profiting from the drug trade, or they were abusing the girls themselves. Barry Shearman, a Labour MP who was the chair of the Children's Schools and Families Committee from 2001 to 2010, while these reports were being developed at the Home Office, admitted that Parliament knew that the children were being abused, quote, up and down the country. We knew about that, but we didn't do enough about it. Members of this House, many of us, knew what was going on. So Dennis McShane, presumably the Home Secretary David Blunkett, Barry Shearman, Jack Straw, all of these Labour MPs knew about it, did nothing, proactively covered it up because it offended their liberal sensibilities. And yet, the current grooming gang inquiries launched by the current Labour government start from 2010 in their research briefing, and will only examine from 1996 onwards, and will only currently look at one named town and two others. They won't always turn the lens inward to Parliament, the Labour Party, and all the other local officials and police forces complicit in the scandal across the country. Another Home Office research-funded project in 2002 found 56 abused schoolgirls had links to just 3 Pakistani brothers. Again, it's a family and clan trafficking network. The information was provided to South Yorkshire Police, but they refused to act at the time. Neighbouring Greater Manchester Police also ignored warnings beginning in 2002, as one victim's mother testified during a 2012 trial in Rochdale. An official report by a health advisor was passed on to a social worker and the police in 2005, detailing the kidnap and abuse of an underage girl in Rochdale, where the gang was operating, but again, the authorities did nothing. The government certainly knew about the pattern among perpetrators and victims by 2007 because the Home Office began funding the Coalition for the Removal of Pimping, CROP. They helped produce the 2008 BBC Panorama programme, Teenage Sex for Sale, which featured Pakistani men on camera condemning English girls for their loose morals and dressing immodestly by Muslim standards, basically saying they brought it on themselves. As McLaughlin writes in Easy Me, after the Panorama documentary was broadcast, questions were asked in the House of Lords. Talking about the levels of violence used by the gangs, Lord McCall of Dulwich reiterated, quote, "Children are much more frightened of the pimps than they are of the law, and the violence that they suffer is terrible. One girl had boiling water held above her throat, another had her tongue nailed to the table." Sadly, this was in the context of a debate about HIV rather than a full debate on the grooming gangs, but what this indicates is that politicians were aware of the contents of the BBC Panorama documentary, but still, the scandal of the grooming gangs would be ignored by Parliament for another 5 years. The BBC reported that the government has said it will produce a warning video for use in all schools. McLaughlin assumes this refers to the information film My Dangerous Lover Boy, which was a video that was never shown to its intended audience. In 2004, a documentary called Edge of the City about Bradford was meant to be shown on Channel 4, but they pulled it, despite reporting on Asian allegations in 2003, worrying that its content would have been a gift to the British National Party at the time. Reminder, the BNP wouldn't have existed if the perpetrators weren't in the country, and so the supposition by the media and the state and the people that are tasked with transparently reporting on the problem and holding an inquiry and hearings on it is that if the people talking about the problem weren't here, then the problem wouldn't exist, rather than the problem creating people talking about the problem. So the instinct is always to censor you and to omit key facts from their inquiry to ensure that the problem continues, because they assume if we all just shut our eyes and hold our hands with the Pakistani perpetrators, we'll all live in some egalitarian utopia like John Lennon's Imagine. And this delusion actually contaminated, as I mentioned earlier, the early whistleblowers. Anne Cryer, in 2003, when she spoke about the gangs, said they were nothing to do with the religion of Islam. She said, "It just happens that Bangladeshi and Pakistani community members are Muslims, and they happen to be the people who persist in the practice of bringing in husbands and wives from the subcontinent. Sikhs and Hindus are doing extremely well, both academically and economically, and I think that's due to the fact they don't pursue this practice." Well, they do pursue cousin and child marriage in their home countries, actually, despite the fact that they have a different religion to Islam, which officially sanctions that, and it's just because it's the clannish practice of the Indian subcontinent. Nevertheless, it's not just Pakistanis and Bangladeshis perpetrating this. As we see in the Netherlands, it's Moroccans and Turks. We've seen in Bristol, it's Somalians. We've seen men crossing on small boats from Afghanistan also participate in the abuse. So no, it's not just a problem with Pakistan, even though they are the majority share of the members of the gangs that facilitate the trafficking and the drugs provided to the victims. And that's just because, I think, of our historic links via the Empire to the Commonwealth, and the fact we allowed thousands of them to come over and establish colonies in our country since the 1950s. We know in Bradford that the government knew about the problem as far back as 1995, because Andrew Norfolk claims that childcare professionals knew Pakistani men were procuring victims from children's homes in 1991, and then a 2011 Barnardo's report acknowledges that the Bradford Streets and Lanes project began to prevent children from being prostituted in 1995. The first prosecution of the gangs didn't happen until 2005, so the government knew about it 10 years before the first prosecution. Despite this, the Barnardo's chief executive Martin Nari denounced Jack Straw when he went on Newsnight and described the attitude of Pakistani Muslim men towards white girls as being one of easy meat. And he said, no, the convictions show that vulnerable children of all races are at risk from abuse. Yet again, obfuscating the problem. Even when Judy Bindel was reporting on the problem in Standpoint magazine in 2010, she fell for the "but we can't help the far right" containment narrative. She lamented that some of the victims' parents that she met were racist and had developed almost a phobia against Asian men, fueled by the misinformation and bigotry trotted out by racist groups in response to the pimping gangs. I might just suggest to Judy Bindel that the problem is not that racist organisations such as the BNP hijack the issue. It's that there are Muslim Pakistani child predator gangs operating in our country, and without them, the BNP wouldn't exist, and they wouldn't have gained any traction. And then, in 2014, after the publication of Dame Louise Casey's report, and the same year as the publication of the Home Affairs Select Committee report that we've been reviewing, a Birmingham newspaper used Freedom of Information access requests to gain access to a West Midlands police report into the grooming gangs that they didn't act on, they didn't publish. It was 125 pages, and it was heavily redacted. But even so, local media was able to conclude the distinctive features of the grooming gang phenomenon from South Yorkshire were to be found in the West Midlands, and this is Peter McLaughlin reporting in Easy Meat on this. The majority of offenders are typically Asian of Pakistani origin, aged from 17 to 40. A number of organised crime groups associated with child exploitation exist in the West Midlands. Many are associated with areas of high population densities of Pakistani heritage. Victims are typically, but not exclusively, white females aged 13 to 16. Approximately a third are living in care homes, and of those living at home, some 25% will have lived in a care home, and up to 60% will have an allocated caseworker. Not only was the same disparity in ethnicity between the victims and the perpetrators found, as in the 2012 report, or in the National Crime Agency report preceding that, but also the report noted that, as with other grooming gangs, quote, targeting of victims takes place mainly at children's homes and schools. That is, according to this report, the majority of the victims have been living in the care of the state and have a state-funded, allocated childcare professional. The gangs were found to be operating not just in Birmingham, but also in nearby towns of Wolverhampton, Coventry, Solihull, Sandwell, Dudley, Lye, Brierley Hill, Tipton, Smethwick, Willenhall, and Walsall. So far, we've only had Oldham named, and that's a small town. The other two haven't been. Already, as early as 2014, we have West Midlands Police acknowledging that a bunch of towns across the West Midlands were afflicted by this. And we haven't heard a peep out of the government in the over a decade since about investigating this. In being forced to release this report, West Midlands Police bemoan the lack of data 4 years after the National Crime Agency also bemoaned the lack of data, and the police report notes that in many cases the local councils seem to know only a fraction of the victims. The grooming gang phenomenon was first publicly observed in Wolverhampton in 1988 and 89, but until the local newspaper forced the police to release this report in 2015, the West Midlands was almost never again publicly identified with the grooming gangs. It was just Rotherham and Rochdale, later Telford, and now Oldham. This is all across the country. It's in London, it's in Derby, it's in Canterbury. It has been for decades. And the government just aren't interested in it. They're not going to look at it. They're not going to look at the 4 preceding decades before 1996, when we know that Pakistanis were committing crimes in this country. The 2 preceding decades when we know that there were grooming gangs operating in Rotherham. They're not going to want to examine the 1997 to 2010 government that was responsible for repeatedly covering this up. They're not going to look at the 50 plus other towns and cities afflicted by this scourge of imported predators. So the entire inquiry, it's just going to be another whitewash. Since West Midlands Police only released this report following a demand under Freedom of Information laws, we conclude the police force would have preferred that this report remained unavailable to the general public. Indeed, a few months later, The local newspaper was able to reveal that a 2010 report by this police force had drawn comparisons between a grooming trial in Derby in 2009 with similar criminal activities going on in the West Midlands. They knew, they've always known, they've just tried to keep it quiet so that we don't know about it. For more on this, again, you can see the link at the top of the description. You can read or listen to the Substack piece, and I hope everyone uses the resources linked in this for future arguments with people when they try to deny or dismiss the grooming gangs, or even treat it as a historical phenomena confined to a couple of locations. It's not. It's pretty much everywhere that we've had Pakistani Muslim migration across the country. I also recommend people at least picking up a copy of McLaughlin's book to archive this so that you can't forget it. This was written in 2016, so it has all of the reporting that was contemporary from the 70s right through the mid-2010s that never gets spoken about because the government would like to pretend that this is just a phenomena that has only been brought to their attention in the last few years, even though members of the sitting Labour cabinet oversaw the 2013 to 2014 Parliamentary report into the gangs that admitted the ethnic disparity, the nature of the predation, and the fact that the police and the government had covered it up for community cohesion reasons over a decade ago. So, what's the solution going forward? Unfortunately, Nigel Farage has declared any privately funded grooming gang inquiry to be pointless, despite having promised to deliver one himself. Early last year, when Labour were dragging their feet about the national inquiry, which has turned into a series of nationally backed local inquiries, supervised by Anne Longfield, which aren't just going to get the job done.
I mean, I've wanted a national grooming gangs inquiry. I've done everything I can to try and push the government into it. The problem is, any third-party inquiry is a waste of space.
I'm not trying to be partisan here, because if Reform form the next government, I want them to succeed. I mean, I'm living in this country, and I want the girls to get justice, and the families, some of whom are still grieving for the children that have been killed and whose bodies have never been found by the gangs, to have some peace. But that's disgraceful. There are multiple victims and families involved in Rupert's privately funded inquiry. I contributed some of the evidence, some of the reporting that I've done, the bespoke stuff, as well as tracking down some of the data, and helped provide it to Barrister Graham Smith, who has drafted the inquiry report, which Rupert is holding in his hands in this image. It will be published in due course, and Rupert has promised to use parliamentary privilege to disclose the identities of people who the inquiry don't think they can secure private prosecutions for, while then seeking private prosecutions for the people that they think they have enough evidence to secure a conviction. Because the names and the crimes were provided by the survivors in the hearings that were recorded and weren't televised because it was so sensitive. I think this is the way that we have to proceed, because currently the government, the state, all of the employees of the civil service, they're just not willing to address the issue. They want to wash their hands of it. They want to make sure that if they were culpable for the cover-up, they don't face consequences. Or if they weren't involved, then they want to perpetuate the cover-up because they are ideologically wedded to the narrative that diversity is our strength and that there is no such thing as an indigestible tribal conflict between groups that can't be resolved by more anti-racist education and more state redistribution of resources. Remember, this is the same Home Office supervising the inquiry that in 2024, after the Southport massacre, produced the Rapid Analytical Sprint report that described the grooming gangs as a grievance narrative invented by right-wing extremists. This is the same Home Office and civil servants that produced the 2018 to 2020 Home Office report that included evidence from the National Crime Agency that found 75% of the perpetrators of, I think it was Type 2 child exploitation crimes, were Asian, Pakistani, and yet still pushed forward the faulty conclusion that a majority of the perpetrators of this crime were white, despite, even in their own findings, the disproportionate per capita overrepresentation of Pakistani perpetrators. This claim was refuted by Baroness Casey in her 2025 audit, when she said, "This audit found it hard to understand how the Home Office paper reached that conclusion, which does not seem to be evidenced in research or data." These are the same civil servants that are going to be supervising this inquiry. The same civil servants who have already told 4 survivors who resigned and then called for the resignation of Jess Phillips from the advisory panel to stop blaming brown men for your abuse. So, the women who have been victimised by Pakistani Muslims have been told, stop making it a race thing by the people that are meant to be supervising this inquiry. This is why we need the private inquiry. The private inquiry has already uncovered the extent of the abuse in towns that haven't been examined yet. The fact that women have been trafficked overseas to Middle Eastern war zones by their perpetrators, that have been sold into slavery, that have been sold into forced marriages in Pakistan, that have never returned. They've provided photo and video evidence. They've named people in the NHS, in local councils and social services that knew about the abuse and helped facilitate it. So it's vital that this be supported. And well done to Rupert Lowe for doing this, for making these promises and fulfilling them. But in the meantime, this is all we can do until a government willing to address the issue, willing to speak honestly about the problem, wins power, and conducts a national inquiry that implicates not just the communities that perpetrated and covered up the abuse, but all the state officials who knew about it and did nothing. They should be stripped of their pensions, they should face prison time, the perpetrators should be at least deported, if not delivered the death penalty if it's returned, and the Pakistani communities that have harboured them and who believe that our women and girls are worthless, are easy meat, just shouldn't be here to continue torturing us in this way. But don't be gaslit. The government's known about this for decades, and this inquiry will intend to do nothing. All we can do is keep piling the pressure on.